couldn't think of a better panel to delve into greater depth than the one we have here to look at the cyber strategy that the Department of Defense put out. Also, as many are not necessarily aware, U.S. Cyber Command, under its combatant commander, Admiral Rogers, put out his commander's intent for Beyond the Build, which is trying to operationalize some of our cyber strategy. Obviously industry, as Congressman Langevin had rightfully noted, is integral to our steps going forward, both from a defense standpoint and from a study we're leading on active defense, which is looking at proactive steps the private sector can take to better defend their systems. So what we thought we'd do is we'll start with Charlie Snyder, who is an advisor for cyber policy at the Office of the Secretary of Defense. No stranger to congressional matters either. He's worked on the Hill and has been a good Sherpa and shepherd for the Department of Defense on Hill matters. He'll start with delving a little deeper in terms of the cyber strategy that OSD put out. Following him is Major General Wegeman, who is the J5. For those who don't know, the J5 is responsible for policy and planning at U.S. Cyber Command. And congratulations on your recent promotion, so that's great news. Following General Wegeman, we'll hear from Mike Papay, who is the CISO at Northrop Grumman. He's been a longtime co-conspirator of ours. He serves on our board and has done yeoman's work. When you like to say it's not rocket science, well, in his case, it is rocket science. He's a rocket scientist. So thanks for joining us again, Mike. And last but certainly not least, we'll hear from Mark Young. Mark has served both in civilian roles on the Hill and at HPSI, at the House Select Committee on Intelligence, but also at U.S. Cyber Command and other roles at Fort Meade, and he's now an executive at IronNet. So, gentlemen, Charlie, why don't we start with you and then kick into a conversation?
Sure. Well, thanks, Frank, and thanks, GW, for hosting this event. I'll speak for just a couple minutes here about the evolution of our cyber strategy at the department and how we think about deterrence. Our strategy has been on the streets for about a year, so I won't rehash it. And I also apparently have some serious mind meld with the congressman, so I'll try not to rehash his thoughts on deterrence as well, but maybe can just provide a little bit of specificity. So the strategy that came out in 2015 was actually our second cyber strategy. And the first one came out in 2011. And I think if you look at the two documents, they're a little more similar than you would maybe think they would be. The technology advances very rapidly, and obviously the threats have been evolving. But a lot of the challenges we face that we seek to build strategies around are more enduring challenges and oftentimes kind of human problems. So when you think about building a culture of security or improving cyber hygiene, or particularly when you look at the fragmented governance for managing cyber across the country and corralling departments and agencies and the private sector to work together. Those are really human problems, and they take a long time to solve. And so, in that respect, I think you see some of kind of the same strategic concepts being repeated. I think the chief difference between the two strategies came as a result of the formation of the Cyber Mission Force at U.S. Cybercom, and that's kind of the operational element of U.S. Cybercom, which didn't exist back in 2011. And so in that 2015 strategy, I think you've seen us really solidify kind of the three strategic missions of the department and of the Cyber Mission Force. So the first one is defending DoD networks, systems, and information. And our Secretary Carter, always calls that job one. That's the number one priority for Cyber Command and for DoD when it comes to cyber. And I'll talk a little bit why that is in a bit. The second mission is preparing to defend the U.S. and its interests from attacks of significant consequence on the homeland. And so that's often, think of a destructive attack on critical infrastructure is what we're worried about there. And the third mission is providing cyber capabilities in support of military operations and combatant command plans. And I think when you think about the development and the evolution since the 2015 strategy, that third bucket is where we've seen a lot of kind of developments. And you've heard the Secretary and the Deputy Secretary publicly commenting on the fact that we are providing cyber capabilities and conducting cyber operations in support of the counter-ISIL campaign. So that's pretty significant to us. And I think you're hearing that as something that's also kind of a reflection of the purpose of the 2015 strategy, which is to be more open and transparent about our intentions and capabilities when it comes to cyberspace operations. To us, that's about building strategic stability so that our kind of higher tier adversaries have a better sense of what our intentions are when we conduct activities. And it's also to make sure that they don't misperceive what those intentions are, which could be escalatory. So, another major purpose of it is to build deterrence. And so on deterrence, we often kind of think, we just build a bunch of tools and capabilities and we conduct a lot of operations and then the adversary is deterred. But really it's about affecting the mind of the adversary and making him perceive that, the juice isn't worth the squeeze, if you will. So on deterrence, I find that the conversation often kind of gravitates towards that higher end deterrence through cost imposition. The congressman called it retaliatory deterrence. And that stuff is really important, and we're investing heavily in this budget request. We're asking for hundreds of millions of dollars for offensive capabilities and deterrent capabilities. But to us, the other two forms of deterrence that the congressman talked about are also really important, deterrence by denial and deterrence through resiliency. And that's why I think the secretary always talks about defending ourselves as job one, because you need to have that solid foundation from which to build upon if you're going to execute your other missions. So when it comes to deterrence by denial, it's about improving our defenses. We try to shrink or reduce our attack surface at the department. So you'll hear about our culture and compliance initiative, which is about training users, anyone who's going to have fingers on a keyboard across the department, to be a little bit smarter about their actions. One of the initiatives that I'm really excited about is our Hack the Pentagon bug bounty pilot, which at its core is about reducing vulnerabilities, a lot of low-hanging vulnerabilities in our public-facing websites, so that we can fix them before our adversaries can get to them. When we think about resiliency, it's both resiliency in terms of our processes and plans. So we've done a lot of work to identify our kind of key terrain across all of our combatant commands and exercise for what we might do if some of that key terrain was held at risk. And it's also about resiliency on a technical level. So in a couple months, you'll see the finals of DARPA's Cyber Grand Challenge, which is about coming up with kind of self-healing networks and automated defenses. So we're investing in all of those categories because obviously our deterrence posture needs to be holistic. And even broader than that, we need to integrate with our interagency partners, because DoD obviously only has one kind of small piece of the pie. And a lot of times we have to act in support of other agencies. So that's some of the things we think about at DoD, and I'm looking forward to Q&A.
Definitely some more questions to pull on. Thank you, Charlie. General?
Good morning. Thanks for having me. Chris Wegeman. For those of you there's a couple of people who actually know me, which is rare when I go to these venues. I'm actually not a technologist. I'm a career-long F-16 fighter pilot that was thrown into this domain from an operationalization, to use that word, perspective. How do you integrate it into an whole-of-government campaign to do the things that Charlie was mentioning? So I'm not the technologist, in case you have those kinds of questions. The DoD cyber strategy for us, from a cyber command perspective, I was actually in the ground floor with Mr. Jonathan Reiber, who helped pen it, and then at the time, Eric Rosenbach was the PCA. And so I'm intimately familiar with where it came from. And the reason I think it's an outstanding frame for us as a command is because I label it more of an action plan than I do a strategy. It really set out in terms of ways and means a deliberate path for us to develop the capabilities and capacities we need to make our cyber mission forces and the whole of cyber workforce in the DoD more effective and efficient. So from that perspective, it's kind of our guide-on right now that's driving us towards deliberate actions and activities to give us and grow capability and capacity, to take the cyber mission force from a develop and build to an employ and deploy operational readiness-minded force, and so that's a good thing. I also believe, from a deterrence perspective, and I won't go too far, I'm looking forward to the Q&A. I'll talk a little bit more about our operational framework too, I'm sure, in a second. But just opening remarks, at Cyber Command, we do believe that cyberspace operations has a significant role in whole of government integrated deterrence. You know, it's not cyber deterrence, it's cyberspace operations role in national strategic deterrence. And we do believe there are things that we can contribute to things we've talked about in terms of classic deterrence theory, imposing costs, denying benefits, demonstrating stake, enabling off-ramps, all these things that are out there for all the deterrence theorists are out of the closet now with cyberspace and where we're going, and that's a good thing. But I'd offer for everyone in terms of how you frame your thinking in deterrence in cyberspace is that it's very nascent. It's an immature thought, and it's emerging rapidly, but it is sometimes dominated by nuclear deterrence theory. And I think that only goes so far, but it certainly helps. And so I'll kind of stop right there. I look forward to the Q&A. I look forward to giving you some more insights into how we are operationalizing the force in support of the missions that have been given to us by the Department of Defense.
Thank you, General. Mike.
Thanks for having me again. It's always a pleasure to work with GW. And so if you look around at the DoD cyber strategy, the federal cyber strategy, the commander's intent for Cyber Command, they really have two things in common. And the first thing that you notice that they have in common is a big focus on developing the right workforce, because that's key to getting it right in the long term. But the other thing they have in common is the ability and the desire to operationalize what we have right now. So those two things are kind of at odds a little bit, because I want to do the job right now, but I want to look down the road and develop the workforce for some future point. You know, the way I see it as the Chief Information Security Officer at Northrop Grumman is that I have to work right now with the people that I have today. And so if you look at an analogy for like a poker game, cyber would be a 5-card stud. I've got 5 cards. I've got to play the best hand that I've got. I don't get a couple of other cards in Hold'em like I do in Texas Hold'em, where I get to turn over a couple more in the field. I don't. It's not 7-card stud where I get to play the best 5 out of the 7 that I've got. This is 5-card stud. I look and see what I've got, and I do the best I can with what I've got right now.
I have a feeling you can count cards, Mike.
I've tried that. That doesn't go over very well in Vegas. And so what you got to do is figure out, okay, where am I going to get those best people that I have to play the game that I'm dealt right now? And at Northrop Grumman, it's easy for me because I look across the board. I see the work that we do for DHS and the work we do for the intelligence community, the work we do for the services. And if I need to, I can go grab those experts and bring them in to help me on my own internal defense of the company. And then I share back the other way. I just turned my lead for incident response over to our job at DHS for US CERT and sent him over there for a year to go work there. And so that sharing of information is really important to get the right people in the right jobs. And I think as OSD and as the services, the intelligence community, and the industry, we need to work hard at sharing the best people that we've got to solve the problem that we have in front of us right now. So I look forward to some questions from the audience and the discussion.
Thank you, Mike. And Mark, I mean, you've seen it from both perspectives, recently joining the private sector, and you've seen the sausage-making process, both from the defense perspective and from the congressional perspective. What are your thoughts if you were to critique it? Where are we today?
It's amazing to me that we struggled in the government with a certain set of problems, and I thought, geez, you know, the private sector really has it over the government 10 times to Sunday with some of these issues, and now that I've spent about 2 years in the private sector, I'm like, holy cow, the government's got it way over the private sector in some areas and not so much in the other. So it's a little bit of a balance. We all have enough work certainly to go around. Thank you, Frank, for putting together this for this session. I think it's really important to look at this strategy, not only with DoD, it's what we're focused on today, but I almost wanted to ask Congressman Langevin if he, in his position on the Homeland Security Committee, would require the same sort of cyber strategy out of the Department of Homeland Security. Because we've seen different GAO reports and things come out about no one's doing cyber right, and I just don't necessarily think that's true. I think you highlight that with the Center for Cybersecurity and Homeland Security, some of the topics that you've looked into. Just real briefly on the defense cyber strategy, I'll say that as a student of folks like Andy Marshall and Richard Rummelt out at UCLA, I have a very kind of a stiff definition of what strategy is all about. It reflects a mindset of shaping the future, not merely reacting to it. It applies unexpected strengths against discovered weaknesses. And it manages, and this is great inside the Beltway terminology, it manages what Rummelt calls slow-moving variables. In other words, the conditions that affect the options that you can construct to bring about a particular end state. So with that in mind, when I look at any strategy, whether it was in the J5 at Cyber Command, whether it was at NSA working with the DNI, whether it was on the Hill evaluating DoD and intelligence community strategies, I'm looking for a description of the problem, a very hard look at what are the challenges that you face, a diagnosis, a choice of guiding policy. What are your guide rails about how you're going to deal with that problem? I want it to be focused on the advantages that you have and the weaknesses of whatever adversary you may seek to best. It channels action and it anticipates reaction. We in DoD used to say an awful lot, the enemy gets a vote. A good strategy incorporates that enemy gets a vote into the strategy. It reduces the complexity of the situation, so particularly in cyber, I think this strategy does a very nice job of distilling some of the challenges that exist, at least within the department, but also does a good job of distilling some of that for the government writ large. And it's not just goals and visions, it's not aspirational, it's really in a definitive way linking, forgive my DoD roots here, it really does link ends, ways, and means. So that's the first thing, a good diagnosis of the problem and choice of guiding policy, and it is about hard choices sometimes, and coherent action. What are the things that you are specifically going to do in a coherent way to bring about whatever end state you seek? Now, general comments on the strategy. I do think that strategy is not a list of aspirational goals and objectives, and yet this strategy takes up an awful lot of white space on the pages about goals and strategy. Needs to be done, but I would prefer a little bit more linkage. The purpose, I think, is a little bifurcated. We've already talked a little bit about it, that it talks about a guide to developing DoD cyber workforce, but then strengthening the cyber defense and cyber deterrence. To me, those are two different things that shouldn't necessarily be in the same document. You've done it well, I think, if you had to jam those two things together. I sometimes think, however, that it was maybe written for more of an internal audience than external, but we can talk about that in Q&A. I do love the fact that contrary to the first cyber strategy from DoD, there's not a lot of hyperbole in there. There's not a cyber Pearl Harbor. It's very fact-based, moderate, measured. And on the deterrence piece, I would say that it's a little handicapped by a lot of the limitation language. In other words, if you read something like NSC 68, it talks about American principles and American values and how we are for this and against that. So we will do everything we can to bring about the destruction of this and the support of that. I think this, by handicapping, I mean that we will exhaust all network defense and law enforcement options before we use cyber operations. We have a limited and specific role in the government and within DoD specific. Those things, I think, signal a particular mindset, which, although true, may not be as beneficial when it comes to deterrence. I'll pile on, and Eric Rosenbach is a dear friend, and I hate to put it this way, but his comments at his SASC testimony about DoD won't respond to all of the cyber attacks that the nation faces, and he put a limitation of only about 2% on there. I think his first point was very valid. DoD shouldn't respond to all of the attacks. General Wegman and I were talking earlier about how DoD is attacked thousands of times a day. We shouldn't be responding to every one of those thousands. So that's correct. But adding that limitation of 2%, I think, although technically correct, may send the wrong message when it comes to deterrence. And of course, then there's Admiral Rogers' statement during his Senate Armed Services Committee where deterrence is not working as we're currently envisioning it. That's on the downside. On the plus side, I think there are statements that are a little subtler in the strategy that do a nice job for deterrence. Unfortunately, offensive is only mentioned twice in the entire document. But if you read between the lines, there's an awful lot of strong statement about the president may call for options. The Department of Defense may interrupt command and control. We will definitely take action in certain places. So I would, on the deterrent side, I would prefer a stronger statement, but the people, the non-US people who will be reading that statement will get some deterrence message out of it, which I think is very valuable. So going back to my initial framework on the diagnosis of the problem, I think the strategy does a great job. It highlights the increased use of cyber attack as a foreign policy instrument, as a political instrument. I think that's hugely important. The fact that it calls out DoD is not as resilient as we want to be. I think that's a great point. I'm a little confused as to the deterrence piece being roped into the strategic context in the strategy, but I think it's, if it's going to be in there, it was written well. The choice of guiding policy, I think, I said earlier that on the deterrence piece that some statements of the strategy weaken that deterrence point, but I think it would have been better to put in things like the strategy talks about American values, freedom of expression, privacy, creativity, opportunity. These things are great. I think the strategy would have done a better job if it had said, and let's face it, some of our adversaries are completely against those. The international strategy for, the DoD strategy calls out the international strategy for cyberspace from 2011, saying that just because an adversary may attack us in cyber, we reserve the right to respond in whatever domain we want. I think that's an important point too. On the plus side, the rule of law featured prominently in the document. I think that's very impressive and important. I'm not crazy about the language about the last resort and the limited role for the U.S. government. And finally, on the coherent action point, I think that there's a long list of activities, very aspirational in nature, that the department lays out in the strategy, all of them necessary, all of them important. I'm not so sure they are tied together in a coherent way as much as they could be in a strategy. But then again, the department has got a lot of challenges with the interagency and with the private sector. And I commend the actual finalization and publication of the strategy. I'm sure it was an
No easy feat.
It was an uphill climb.
Mark, thank you. And let's jump right into a conversation, because I think you framed it very well, and I think everyone jumped right into some of the points. So, I mean, it's been said, at least by me, that cyber deterrence has been the missing dimension of our cyber statecraft, and up until recently. And I do think not only the DoD strategy beyond the build, but I also think nothing like a galvanizing mission, the anti-ISIL mission here, to be able to bring some of these pieces beyond theory into actual practice. So firstly, from a cyber deterrence perspective, you deter actors, not things. Someone said we want to be shaping, not reacting. I think modern military strategy will tell you we often go and march into the future looking through rear view mirrors, and that's not the best way to fight tomorrow's conflict, war, and the like. What are these litmus tests? Okay, let's talk about operationalizing some of this. What will it take? Have we seen in past precedents, can we look back to any incidents that would have triggered a deterrent to some extent or another? Technology will continue to change. The attack surface grows exponentially. There are potentials for single point failure. But at the end of the day, human nature remains pretty consistent. So whatever their means, their intent is going to remain relatively consistent. This is a difficult question to look in the past, but what would have triggered a response in kind commensurate to a particular set of incidents? And how do we ensure that cyber and cyber deterrence in particular is front and center to the next commander-in-chief, whoever she or he may be? So let's start with you.
Sure. Thanks, Frank. In terms of previous incidents that may have triggered some type of action from us, I don't think we need to torture ourselves thinking too hard, because as you mentioned, it's not the means necessarily. It doesn't matter if it's something through the cyber domain or something in the kinetic world. It's the significance of the event. And it's always a small p political decision about whether we're going to respond militarily or through some other tool. So, in that context, I think it's hard to take it, in a vacuum and say, would this event have resulted in this action? Each of those events was, digested by whichever current administration was there, and a determination was made on the proper response. In terms of tools and precedents to leave a future administration, I think the best we can do is leave for the future the most amount of work and precedents and tools that we can. So for us, for the department, the biggest thing is the build of our cyber mission force, which still has a couple years to go. But this administration has already also established new sanctions tools and investments for the future, things that came out of the Cyber National Action Plan, which came with both funding and initiatives. And I think that's really the best that we can do is leave the future administration with more tools than maybe this administration started with.
General, and clearly, obviously, policymakers determine some of those actions. But give me confidence. Are we ready to go when the balloon goes up?
We're getting there. Absolutely getting there. I think that the key ingredients that are emerging rapidly that we in the cyber domain don't have, that the other classic warfighting domains have, is competence, credibility, and trust of the national leadership. We have to prove ourselves a capable adversary that has due diligence, the proper controls and mechanisms in place, and that we are as good as we say we are. This is the Billy Mitchell event of 1921 for us, right? We have to bomb and sink the boat, the Ostfriedlander, I think it was a German battleship, right? We are at cyber at that inflection point. We need to make sure that we can understand and articulate collateral effects estimates and gain the credibility, again, as an airman, like we have in the air domain, where we can hold any pinpoint part of the globe accountable day, night, 24/7 via some precision instrument. And we have to show that cyberspace can do that. I do think we are growing the capabilities and capacities right now. I do think we're actually starting to demonstrate those capabilities and capacities, and I think that's key to moving forward and doing more. So again, I kind of go back to that street cred, if you will, for what's required. In terms of what I think is going to keep this across the transition of administrations, it's real simple: the adversary. They are gaining intent, they're gaining capability and capacity, be they state or non-state, cyber criminals, cyber hacktivists. So there's just going to be no daylight in terms of the vulnerabilities that we're exposing ourselves to and the things that they're taking advantage of. So I think that's what's going to carry the torch across from any administration to the next. This is just going to become a more complex and challenged environment. I think the Internet of Things right now is about 6.8 billion devices, and by 2020 I think that number goes to about 20.8 billion devices. And so it's here to stay.
Frank, just a quick note, the Secretary of Defense himself said that essentially that the Sony attack would have been a significant consequence event, that had we had the tools in place, that would have been something to which the DoD may have responded to. That was just in SASC testimony. But I think that's a nice data point for saying that's the kind of thing to which the Department of Defense may respond to in the future.
Gentlemen, I want to pick up on the unfair question. I mean, Billy Mitchell spoken like a true Air Force guy, and I actually did write a piece comparing cyber to where Billy Mitchell is, so love the analogy. But one of the questions I would ask, do we have the structure, are the rules of engagement in place? Do we need to see those mature further? How do we deconflict across the various entities, agencies within the defense structure and then beyond? Are we ready?
So I would
Almost?
say, no, we are ready actually, and I would say that we have the portfolio of structure and authorities in place. But it's what I would call it's Gen 1. And so what it lacks is responsiveness because it's new. And so do we have the speed and agility that we need? No, but it's coming quickly. And so we do have the structure. In terms of how we operationalize the Cyber Mission Force, the chairman gave us a task last fall to basically do a dedicated mission analysis on how we would apply the Cyber Mission Force across the full spectrum of conflict, the full range of military operations, from deter, shape, and or escalation control, all the way to supporting an all-domain integrated kinetic fight in a phase 3 conflict like the combatant commands are focused on. When we did this analysis, this whole thing is called strategic balance. What we came up with is a dedicated operational framework from command and control, policy authorities, and force assignment, which allows us now, through a global synchronizing function, to actually get after that full range of cyberspace operations across the full spectrum of conflict trans-regionally around the globe. So what I'm using a lot of buzzwords to tell you is we actually now have the command and control structure. We have the planning process in place. We have stolen, if you will, from our friends at Special Operations Command and from Transportation Command, who are global synchronizers, both in counterterrorism and global logistics. And now we're using that to globally synchronize our cyberspace planning and operations. And that process is running through its first tranche right now. We have gained a portfolio of authorities which allow us to do the things and take the actions we need to do in peacetime, as well as those places where we have execute orders and authorities. Used to be a lot of conversations about authorities, and I really believe, and I can let Charlie if he agrees, but I think we have the authorities we need. I think we have the processes in place with the interagency and the coordination and deconfliction. I think it's a matter of optimizing those processes and gaining responsiveness in action.
Awesome. I'm happy to hear that. I've got a lot I could follow up, but Mike and Mark, I wanted you to.
So I grew up in a deterrence kind of environment. When Frank talks about I'm a rocket scientist, my actually first job with the company 30 years ago was building ICBMs. And so we'd get up as young 20-something-year-olds and read the LA Times, and we'd look down and we'd see the Soviets parading SS-24s and SS-25s, road mobile, rail mobile systems through Red Square. We'd go, I'm going to work. Because that was important to everybody at that time. Everybody got up and we ran to work because of the deterrence of building things like the Peacekeeper ICBM and the small ICBM for the Air Force that held those threats at bay.
And you could see it, you could visualize it, you could feel it, you could touch
so
it.
what I feel now is the same kind of deterrence motivation from my cyber workforce. They read all this in the newspaper, they read about the real threat to our critical infrastructure, they read about the threat to our way of life, and they get up and they go, I'm going to work. But the difference is, today they get a chance to exercise those skills on an everyday basis. You know, back then there were people that worked for 25, 30 years building ICBMs, and they really hoped they never get used. Today, the kind of tools that we're using in cyberspace to deter our adversaries, whether it's setting up better detection algorithms on the externally facing websites for the Pentagon, that's a deterrence. Those are things that get used every day. And so people are more excited because not only do they have the deterrence position in place, but they also get to use what they're learning.
I think despite my comments about what the actual written strategy says, the comments by administration and department officials, DoD officials, has had a great deterrent effect.
Yeah.
With the General Wegman talked about the statements that were being made by the Secretary about what we're doing against ISIS. I think that's hugely valuable. That coupled with the strategy, that coupled with what people speculate the department is doing is also hugely valuable in the deterrence realm. I don't think that cyber deterrence is as nascent as my colleagues do, only because with an NSA background, I know there were a lot of classified activities that were occurring that definitely shaped behavior. And it's subtle, it's one-off, it's very carefully done, and it's approved at the highest levels of the government. So I think that we do know more about this than some people think, but it's all a very case-by-case, very specific example. Institutionalizing it, I think, is a little bit difficult, but the better we get, the more we learn, the more it will become more public, I think.
But Mark, just to pull that thread, I mean, deterrence, by obviously you're signaling changes in behavior, trying to induce changes in behavior in one sort or another. And you've got to be able to signal, and you've got to be able to follow through. I think that's where some of the questioning may be, whether or not we've put nouns on the board and haven't always followed those up with verbs. And I'm not suggesting red lines in the sand or red lines in the silicon or whatever the heck you want to talk are going to be the same, because at the end of the day, they're not. And there are many tools beyond cyber to be able to respond. But the Soviets knew we had a nuclear capability. We demonstrated that capability. We had tests. We exercised. I haven't seen the same modicum yet outside of media reporting of what are ostensibly some of our capabilities are.
So that's a great point. I would say that I'm not going to challenge General Wegman to confirm or deny what I'm about to say, but I would say that if you don't think that the Russians are watching carefully what we're doing against ISIS, now publicly stating it only as far as the Secretary of Defense, which I think is hugely valuable, and I think that those examples, both with being a little bit more public about cyber guard and cyber flag, and some more interagency, hey, the U.S. government took this action. And in fact, the indictments that we talked about earlier, they are a deterrence factor. So I think that is helpful, and I think
And
we have
Iran, I
done
might
things.
know, very similar. So, because no nation worth their salt is going to send the muddy
That's right.
footprints back to the Kremlin. They're going to use proxies or whatever else. I want to allow 2 quick questions that I'll trigger, and then we'll allow some time for the audience. But look at this internationally. And obviously, we have our own national capabilities. But do you see a day where we have joint, combined computer network attack sorts of capabilities? Are the alliances in place that we need? Should they be? How should we be rethinking, if at all, where cyber fits into all of this? And then I want to ask a very specific question. So public-private partnerships, long on noun, short on verbs there. I mean, we are starting to see some activity, and it's great to see some facilitated information sharing. But I would be curious from our defense colleagues whether or not the private sector, what else they need from the private sector to make it a reality. And then I'd like to ask from our private sector, admittedly, this is more defense industrial based, but what else they could get from the government to make that real. So why don't we start internationally, maybe with Charlie, go down, and then for the second question, start with Mark and then go back up. So
Sure. So our international partnerships are hugely important, and you emphasized the attack portion, but I think, particularly as we think of crawl, walk, run, the defensive side is even more important.
I'm glad you called me on that.
And some of our partners may be more advanced, and there's more interesting operational collaboration that we can and will facilitate. But in general, the stage we're at with a lot of our partners is at the kind of information sharing and relationship building stage. And the defensive side is really important for us because obviously as a department, we have a global posture and a global presence. And so we rely on foreign critical infrastructure networks to provide us power and fuel and other logistics. So, at this stage, with the vast majority of partners that we want to work with, it's more about just building that relationship and getting a better understanding of where their vulnerabilities lie. And it's only, in more special circumstances with, maybe Five Eyes partners and things like that, then we can start thinking more about joint, combined efforts.
We'll save the public-private question later. General?
Yeah, I would fully echo what Charlie was saying. So from a cyber command perspective, so I own the international portfolio in the J5, both interagency and international. And we are working very, very hard to nurture and increase the relationships we have abroad with key partners in this space. Collective defense is the preponderance of our weight of effort, and it needs to be. Offense is sexy. It's a lot harder. There's very few partners that have the level of tradecraft that we do, and so obviously it's a limited space from that perspective. But the collective defense is key. The Five Eyes partner, NATO as an alliance, we are now engaging with SHAPE at the headquarters level to understand what they're doing in terms of their cyber defensive program and how we can both collaborate and share information and where possible intelligence to grow the collective defense for those places where we have our missions in support of the combatant commands and the nation around the world. I think that's the key message with where we're going. I will also say that we also...
What about on Article 5 specific sorts of questions there? You think we fleshed that out at the political level?
I'm not sure where the NAC's been lately with that conversation. Actually, Article 4 as well has been in play.
It's a big one.
The last thing I heard that is very interesting to me as an American is the fact that they have yet to finally come out of the closet on declaring cyberspace as an operational domain. Even that is a hard question for the alliance. I think they're there. I'm not sure it's come out in the NAC yet. I think that's on the event horizon. But where I was going, just one last thought, is there is a spectrum of relationships that are out there right now, anywhere from information sharing and collaboration all the way towards where we want to go in terms of power through partnerships as part of our Beyond the Build vision. And so where we have the right partners against the right enemies, we want to do joint combined arms operations, fully integrated, just like we did when I flew line abreast with the UK in Desert Storm, in January of 1991. We want to do the same kinds of things. We actually are getting after that. And so there is a end-to-end, we're working on all that. And so that's good. But it's all about managing expectations. For certain partner nations, they're just not there yet. And so those relationships just focus on collective defense and information sharing. But we have some partners that do bend bilaterally, multilaterally across the whole spectrum of operations.
Thank you, General. Mike?
So since cyber is a big global problem and Northrop Grumman's a big global security company, I travel a lot. That's one of the key things that I hear all the time is, hey, you're the cyber expert for Northrop Grumman. When can you bring some of these tools and some of these techniques and some of the things that we need to us? So we do what we can. I heard Congressman Langevin talk a little bit about Cyber Patriot. Cyber Patriot used to be a high school cyber competition for the United States. Now it's grown well beyond that. We had over 3,300 schools participate in the competition last year at both the high school and the middle school level. We've taken it to the UK as Cyber Centurion. We've taken it to Saudi Arabia as Cyber Arabia. And so getting that out there and building up that workforce so that they're capable of using those tools when it gets to the point where we're comfortable enough with them as partners, not just in information sharing, but in actually getting the trust by collectively using tools together. I think they're going to be ready when the need arises. So I think you build your trust based on the defense, and eventually you get to the point where you're comfortable enough to go offensively together.
Just because the line between offense and defense, exploit and attack, it's so thin. It hinges around intent. But Mark?
I think from the private sector perspective, I would say that I think the Department of Defense is best, but other departments and agencies need to be a little bit more intellectually agile about the art of the possible. So we've built up an enormous array of regulation and oversight, all proper, all needed. I just think that we can construct an oversight and a regulatory environment where you can still get the benefit of quick-moving United States entrepreneurial leadership, especially in the technical arena. And even the Defense Cybersecurity Strategy, it does address that. It says that's one of the list of the things, the actions that the department's going to be taking, so looking into the DFARS and looking into Silicon Valley and trying to do things better. My soapbox, both when I was in the government and now that I'm out, is that we have a structure and a mindset that was built in the industrial age for the government. It was right at the time. It hasn't been right for a long time since we are well into the information age. So there's got to be a way to restructure the way we're doing business within the government and between the government and the private sector to get things a little faster. Because really, especially in cybersecurity, whether it's defense or offense, the fastest person will win.
I think that's very insightful. And I might note another differentiator with defense strategy and civilian. I mean, it's the difference between General Eisenhower said, in preparation for battle, I've often found plans to be useless, but planning to be indispensable. And it's that planning function, which I don't know many agencies that do well outside of the Department of Defense. And even the Department of Defense, it took a lot of scar tissue to get that right. But the hot washes, the after action, I don't know as many that do that as well right now.
We talk in an operational sense about the importance of the private sector, but I see very few departments other than DoD exercising with the private sector.
Exactly.
So when the balloon does go up, we're going to have relationships to be able to make decisions very quickly, and unless you've exercised that, you're not going to get out of the starting gate.
Very quickly, realizing the intent between public-private partnerships. Let's hear first from our defense folks and then from our private sector.
Sure. So it's no secret that Secretary Carter's put a lot of skin in the game to try to fix this. So he talks a lot about building and rebuilding bridges to the private sector. And he's followed through with putting real mechanisms and offices in place. So there's the Defense Innovation Unit Experimental, which he just rebooted last week out in Silicon Valley, that will be that kind of bridge between figuring out the right requirements and problems that the department has, and then figuring out the right players out on the West Coast and soon to be on the East Coast as well, who can help solve them. We are trying to invest heavily in InQtel, which has been traditionally the intelligence community's venture arm. And he also stood up a direct report to him called the Defense Digital Service, which is all about bringing in private sector tech expertise. So that's part of it. The other part, I find a lot of these challenges with technology and acquisition, sometimes it's the regulatory or the statutory problems, but a lot of times it's also cultural. And interpreting, for instance, new statutes we've been given. So Cyber Command has an acquisition authority now that they are starting to implement. We have rapid acquisition authorities for cyber that came in the last NDAA. And the way we implement that is just as important as getting those authorities to begin with. And again, it gets down to culture. So my hope is that the kind of example that the Secretary sets in being very aggressive about doing this and getting this done in the right way will kind of bleed down across the department so we can make some kind of meaningful, irreversible change.
General, anything you need from the private sector?
Love the private sector. So the thing you have to keep in mind is the Cyber Mission Force was put online to protect the Department of Defense as our priority number one, the Department of Defense Information Network, the DISN core that runs that, all the weapon systems and platform IT that supports our global operations and how we project and employ power around the world. The national teams that a lot of people kind of conflate in this space are threat actor focused in terms of what they can do to defend the nation against an attack of significant consequence. So where we sit as a command right now, and Charlie and I have had a couple of conversations, is we are now at the next level of detail in sorting out what is the mission expectation of the Cyber Mission Force in the conduct of defense outside of DoD in support of a private sector entity. What is it that we need to be prepared to do specifically? And so it's a great conversation. So the policy experts are talking it through, and we're trying to figure that out. Regardless of what we would do, the key to it is going to be like the key to how you provide any type of military support to a civilian sector activity, which is going to be, in my opinion, the ability to talk left of boom. Is going to be the fuel that makes it all work, right? We need some type of a way to do, assuming there's an appetite to do this, because our mission within the Department of Defense is all consuming with the forces and capabilities we have, in my opinion. But if we're going to do some of this outside of that, which I think there's an expectation to some degree, we're going to need some level of prescripted mission, and we're going to need to have a prioritization of who are the key private sector entities we should be engaged with. That's a challenge in itself. And then what do we need to do and talk about ahead of time so that if and or when called upon, and given that direction with your proper vested authorities, we can actually be of effect and be responsive and actually do the things that the nation would expect the Department of Defense to do in a defensive mission. So I think that's the key. And I'll leave it there.
And all hinging around trust, right? So
Absolutely.
Ultimately.
I think the public-private partnerships work best when they're attacking sort of an ill-defined problem. The cyber resilience of things that move or things that fly or things that are critical infrastructure is a really great example. So Frank, from the first paper you and I wrote on building cybersecurity into the acquisition process, we've gotten a lot of feedback, a lot of government organizations coming to industry and saying, hey, that's really great. How should we do that? And I'm saying, well, I don't know exactly, but let's push this idea. And so together we've been able to come up with an approach about how to manage cyber for platforms or things that fly as a risk-managed framework. You got to think about it as a risk. You can't say, this is a checklist, and I'm going to go look down each one of the items and see if you've solved it, and if you haven't, then you fail. And if you got to organize the risks to those things that fly in the order in which they would be bad. And you take off the bad ones first, and then you get down to eventually the ones that I could live with that, it'd be all right. And so that public-private partnership, which includes academia as well, is really about figuring out a solution together. There may be no formal mechanism for getting that done, but it's a collective of experts. It's people who have been on both sides, have been rocket scientists and cyber folks, or have been operational and have been in academia. And getting those people together to think about the problem and solve that problem is where I think the best public-private partnership exists.
Awesome.
I definitely agree. The interesting thing for some of us, though, is there is precedent for this. Granted, it was at a much smaller scale, I think it was in 2011 when the Deputy Secretary of Defense, Bill Lynn, published an article in Foreign Affairs that described what we had at NSA at the time called the Enduring Security Framework. And this was a small group of industry leaders and the director of NSA who would get together to discuss those very problems that Mike just outlined. And it was the director's opportunity to say, hey, I'm seeing this based on my intelligence mission. You as industry, how are you going to deal with this problem going forward? And there were a number of excellent technical projects that came out of that engagement that really protected the nation. So for those of us who know that there are ways to do this, the fact that we've stumbled a little bit and we've got the ISACs and the ISAOs now, which are good, definitely necessary. We just need to get the right people with an operational mindset to get some of this information sharing done and the exchange of information and ideas between the government and the private sector.
Awesome, and we could have asked this of Congressman Langevin to get a sense of whether or not legislatively everything is that it's cracked up to be. But I want to allow some time for questions, and please identify yourself. A question back there, then here, then there, and then there.
David Young from Oxford Analytica. Frank, at the last one of these I came to, you had the French minister on cyber and gave a terrific talk. And at the end of it, you said this behooves us all to really understand the underpinning of political jihadist Islam. And my question is really specifically, how much of the anti-ISIL mission that's out there now actually has to do with content and understanding really the theological underpinnings of the jihadist Islam narrative? I think this is a profound question for the West to answer, both British, French, and American intelligence. And you guys are the ones, hopefully, can make that link to the content.
Sure. So, I'm not an expert on the counter-ISIL campaign. I can say that, we have, the Secretary on down have said we're committed to stamping out that ideology wherever we see it. Where it intersects with, our cyber operations and things like that, I'll just have to let kind of the comments of the Secretary and the Deputy Secretary speak for themselves because I can't comment on it.
Anyone else want to?
Yeah, so from a military perspective, obviously there's been a comprehensive amount of intelligence and center of gravity analysis based on ISIL, and I think the three key things that are out there, if you read, is their ability to inspire, which is their narrative, to your point, is something that is a significant either operational or strategic center of gravity for them, as well as their ability to conquer, so seize and hold terrain, and then ultimately their ability to employ statecraft to provide for those people that they've said, okay, now this is our terrain and you work for us. So absolutely, and I think the narrative is something that we're all working on across the whole of government, specifically from a cyber perspective, because it is not a .mil space problem, it's a .com space problem. And so the arrows that I have in my quiver are very limited. But the key is how do we partner together to come up with a whole of government and even with international partners, because this narrative is a multilingual narrative. And so we're working through those challenges abroad. And I actually think we're having good effect. We're having great effect with the private sector and the .com spaces and their ability to take that message down and respond. Working with DHS, the FBI, it's been phenomenal to watch.
General, I might just underscore that part of that terrain, though, is cyberspace itself. And up until recently, we've ceded good chunks of that battlefield to the adversary. And the reality is, do you string them up? Do you string them along? Do you shut it down? Do you keep it open? These are all very difficult collection questions versus operations.
I think you start with everything you can do, and you try and figure out everything you need to do and move that way.
Well said. We'll leave it at that. Gents, anything you want to add on that?
Just so that's an excellent question, and I know when I was at Cyber Command we wrestled with it, but you got to think of it in terms of a continuum. So there's, on one side of the scale, there's a message that's going to be posted on a jihadi website that says there's going to be a group of Americans meeting at this place at this time. Let's kill as many as we can. That, to me, there's no choice. That's something that has to be interdicted. On the other side, there's a promulgation of ideology that we as Americans don't like to interrupt, we don't want to curtail that free speech, even if it's against what we believe. I think that's very important too. So don't do anything on this side of the spectrum, definitely interdict on that side of the spectrum. Those are easy questions. When it gets to the middle, where we're not really sure, what do we do? And typically we elect not to do anything. Well, at least, I'm sorry, I shouldn't say it. When I was in government, we would elect not to do anything. And I think that's probably the safer course. But my concern is that there are very few people looking at that small area where we're not really sure. We want to stick to American values, but we want to save American lives at the same time.
Can I just note, this will be a focus of our entire session on Thursday with Mike McCall, and how do you undermine and expose the hypocrisy of ISIS and other jihadist narratives. So that's an issue we've looked at extensively. If we can table some of that conversation till future sessions. So we had a question here, then there, then we'll get Alan, then there. So.
Hello, my name's John Gardner, retired intelligence officer. I have a doctorate from GW focusing on operations research and various applied methods of problem solving. With that background,
Are you looking for a job?
I'm sorry?
Are you looking for a job? Because I could.
I absolutely do not want a job, but I would love to promote jobs for people who combine these modes of thinking. I'd like to focus on two terms that were mentioned, and I'll add one more. Intellectual agility. That's what I'm after here. Five-card stud is a limitation on your range of freedom of activity and dealing with things, and then to limit this whole thing to just one small area of cybersecurity. Defense as an offense, using your defensive mechanisms to disrupt the enemy. Okay. What I'd like to illustrate by this, and my question is, to what extent is the thinking that I'm going to outline here already incorporated into what you're doing? In my experience in years of research, you need to bring in every conceivable tool that you have. This is an intellectually agile area anyway, and when I think of that in terms of applied math, I think of communication theory, information theory, game theory, all of the ways of thinking in a devious or outside the box, outside the parallel universes area. To try to bring in something from outside that increases your capability to deal with the issues you're dealing with. In terms of five-card stud and the idea of offensive defense, I would even bring in rhetoric. How can you make your defenses appear to the enemy to be telling him one thing about your defenses, but really misleading him and forcing him to spend lots of money and manpower and brain power on solving problems that you've already got solid solutions to, but your defenses are misleading him to believe that he's got to put a lot more effort into some other effort. So
I hate to cut this up, but there are a lot of questions.
And my question is, to what extent is this kind of devious thinking already incorporated in the work that's being done in your groups?
Denial by deception, thoughts, guys?
I'll take just a quick stab. I think that when you have an organization as large as the Defense Department, there are tendencies to try to standardize everything and have kind of a standard playbook. So, when you see adversarial activity, you just squash it. And you want to make your defenses across the board look as kind of formidable as possible. I think what you're talking about, though, is really important because our adversaries, are very smart and are very dynamic. So I think that's, incorporating things like information operations and deception and things like that may have a better effects in specific cases, but it's just hard to inculcate that across, an organization that has 3 million employees. But it's definitely something that is of interest and that we're working on.
I might note the Russians are very active in Muscatovka. CC&D, as you would call it, camouflage, concealment, deception. That is central to all of their cyber. We tend to think of it more as computer network attack. For the Russians, it's more psychological operations with cyber built in.
I will say, sir, that there's been somewhat of an exodus of national security professionals into the private sector and a lot into cybersecurity. And I will say that there's an awful lot of us who weary of the asymmetry of the cybersecurity problem, meaning you as the defender have to be right 100% of the time and the attacker only has to be right once. I would say that the private sector is beginning to flip that paradigm. So as the attacker, you have to be right 100% of the time, and I as the defender have to be right once.
And I think
just
that's
the
what
right
you
way
see
to
is sort of solutions that you never would have thought you'd see before, where you get all of the defense industrial base companies partnering together and sharing information freely about the attacks that they're seeing, the specific tactics, techniques, and procedures, and shared rapidly across the board so that an attack on one company is instantly beaten down by all the other companies. The banks are doing the same thing. The technology companies are doing the same thing. I'll bet when you asked all the cyber startups 5 years ago, hey, are you guys going to share information with each other about your global threat intelligence database, they would have said, no, that's my bread and butter. That's what really makes my company great. And now you see those technology companies all sharing their threat information and then working on the harder parts of the problem. So I think pulling out all the stops, I think that's happening.
And Cyber Threat Alliance is moving in that.
Yeah.
One thing I might note, the defense industrial base is further along than all the other critical infrastructure sectors, finance and banking close second. We would like to see how lessons from the DIB can be applied. We actually have a project on that for transparency. So we had Ellen, or Jim, and then Ellen. Okay.
Good setup for the question I had. It seems to me that
Jim, if you can identify.
Okay, my name is Jim Cavalier with IDA. The whole area of information sharing, it seems to me among our critical infrastructure partners that they're still mired in the framework that the government has the answers, and if we just open the warehouse, they'll be there. With the exponential growth of the cybersecurity providers, threat providers, using pretty much the same tradecraft, how do we change that dialogue? Because it seems to me that most of what they need they can get from the providers and not look and get limitedly focused on the government, those very unique things that government's capable of doing. But they're still looking to government for the answer, and I don't think that's where we need to change the debate, I would suggest.
Which is very similar to where we were right after 9/11. If I just had my TSSCI and had the ability to get behind the green door, I'd have all the answers.
I almost think that the answer is in what Mike said moments ago, that as the private sector, whether it's the DIB or finance sector or oil and gas, if they're sharing information, they need to rely less on the government. You see it in the DoD strategy that the government is going to have a very specific role, especially DoD. And you're never going to be able to get the, we used to say that all the combatant commanders would come to NSA asking for more. And we're already pushing as much information to you as we can. It's not like we're sitting back saying, oh, I don't think CENTCOM needs that information. We're saying, hey, that there's a risk to providing it, therefore we're not going to. But that was very, very small percentages, extraordinarily small. I think a lot of the intelligence community has the reputation of holding back more than it does, but that's just my biased opinion. But I think if the private sector starts sharing amongst itself, it's going to see an exponential increase in their capabilities to deter some of these threats, defeat some of these threats.
And it really goes beyond just information sharing about signatures and threats. And when I talk about sharing information with my DIB partners, it's about setting up an integrated defense, integrating all these technologies and tools and processes into a cohesive defense in real time. So if I buy a new tool, I'm going to go ask one of my defense industrial base brothers, hey, have you guys installed this before? And they'll say, yeah, let us come help you. Let us tell you about the lessons learned that we had when we installed this on our network. Do this first, do this second, and then do. It happens all the time. That's the kind of information sharing that we need to get to beyond just real-time threats.
And you see that at some point automated, right? Where you can build on Styx Taxi and some of the initiatives, DHS through NKIC and others. You see that coming.
It's got to. And let's face it, we do that in crisis now anyway. Especially when you see you go back a few years and look at the financial sector attacks that happened. Competitors were talking real time, sharing information with each other, and as long as we can institutionalize that left of boom, then we'll be much better off.
Ellen, you've got the last question.
Ellen Nakashima from the Washington Post, and thanks, Frank, for putting this together. I think it's been a very informative session. I've been covering Cyber Command since the startup back in 2009 when Secretary Gates issued the order, and we had IOC, and then 2010. So it's heartening to see finally starting to operationalize and actually do campaigns. On the counter-ISIL campaign, in which, by the way, I think it's great that Secretary Carter is transparent about it and actually openly speaking about it. For you, General Wegman, I have a few questions. How have you, can you describe the process by which you are deconflicting with, say, the intelligence community in terms of any information that you might lose from the IC, or in terms of weighing the balance of gain and loss for DoD operations and loss to the IC? Has that been a problem? And then secondly, how do you, what are your metrics for determining success in this counter-ISIL campaign? How do you know when you've been successful?
Great. Thanks for those questions. Yeah, that was real simple. Let me just
It just goes away.
Let me just throw out, I think it's important to say that I'm not going to talk about specifics on ongoing operations. What uniform wear, I wouldn't start off with that. But you bring up a very common question, which is how do we go through an equitable process in terms of intelligence and operational gain loss? So we have a process that's in place. It's an interagency coordination process. We have several other executive orders that govern the SIGINT system and other things that tell us how to do these things. They've been in place before. So there's actually two hoops we jump through. One is literally deconfliction in the space, and the second one then is equities. So intelligence versus operational gain loss. It's a fora of interagency partners. You can imagine the standard actors are there between those, FBI, CIA, DHS, et cetera, et cetera. And we have a conversation about what it is we intend to do. And so how's it going? It's tough sledding. For all the right reasons. It's new, and so we're cutting our teeth. We're working a lot with our OSD partners to help us broker a lot of these things, but I think we're making good headway, and we're doing it in a very responsible way, which is essential to my last part about we have to have street cred and credibility and trust in how we do this. So it's important we get it right rather than we just do something and do it quickly. And so that's what I'll offer for the IGL, OGL in those conversations. So the second part about metrics, it's a great question. Helps me kind of pivot to normalization. Cyberspace as a warfighting domain, we want to normalize. And so the way we get measures of effectiveness in the application of combat power is just like any other warfighting domain. We put out an all-source collection plan that looks at what activity would take place and then what intelligence assets across all of the all-source equities are available, things that we can fly, things that we can listen through, people in the battle space, if they exist, human, SIG, all the ints. And we designed a plan to pull back information that will tell us that we had an effect, first of all. And then second, did we have, if it's a cognitive effect, did we get that effect? So a measure of performance. We have a collection plan that tells us did the technology perform, the tradecraft perform right? And then we actually have other things that get into measures of effectiveness. So
Can you give an example or for instance? Like, are you talking about number of networks down?
So for an example, if you're going against a network for whatever reason and you can see the network management, and if the network management operator is saying, hey, I'm noticing there's these issues with the networks, and for whatever reason we could collect that information, we could see that there's some type of a performance effect occurring. And then you'd have to get into, is there an actual operational effect from that? So as an example, using the SIGINT system to do something like that.
The tyranny of time requires I be a tyrant. We could go on much longer. Please join me in thanking an amazing panel and for all you do every day. Thank you. And thanks for everyone for joining.